Hi there. So before I get started, chances are if you're clicking on this video, it's because I've personally asked you to. And so I just wanted to begin by saying thank you so much to everyone who has agreed to look at this video and provide feedback and advice and criticism. I really can't communicate how grateful I am for all of the support that I've gotten from so many people, both experts and lay people like me. And even though this is still a draft, I hope that, and I know that in time, it will become better. I think so anyway. And it wouldn't have been possible to even do this without all of the support that I've gotten. So I felt it appropriate to begin by saying thank you. But I guess to tell you a little bit about myself, I'm a dietitian from Australia. And for the past 2 years, I've developed a passionate interest in trying to understand why people have crooked teeth and jaws. So really, my story begins when I was lying in a dentist's chair, having laughing gas liberally pumped into my lungs, as I had 4 teeth removed as part of standard braces procedure. This was probably the first time in my life that when I was somewhere between lucid and hallucinating, that I seriously asked myself what the cause of this was. It was as if for the first time I was actually acknowledging how strange it was that so many people had issues with the development of their teeth and jaws. When I asked my orthodontist about this, I was given a very vague explanation about how when one parent has small jaws and the other has large teeth, the end result could be a child with crooked teeth and jaws. Now, while I didn't find this particularly convincing at the time, I mentally put it aside. That is, until I came across reconstructions of Paleolithic skulls as part of a high school project. What I saw amazed me. It seemed that the people of the past, as we will soon find out, ubiquitously had robust facial structure, straight teeth, and correctly aligned jaws, which was nothing like what I saw in the modern world. To put it simply, I was convinced something had to be responsible for this change, and I collected as much research as possible to try and prove it. This presentation is the final culmination of that work. Before we get started, I would like to have a disclaimer and say that I don't have any financial conflicts of interest, at least none that I know of, and I'm not financially associated with any of the people, organizations, or devices I will be talking about here. I also am not a professional in this subject, and so the risk that I may misinterpret evidence or make errors is high. So please take everything I say with a grain of salt, as this is still a learning process for me personally. I've included all of the research sourced in an essay, which you will find at the bottom of this video. So any of the studies can be double checked, and I would really appreciate any feedback and advice, both from experts in the field and interested lay people. So if you have any thoughts you'd like to share, please email me at josephthedietitian@gmail.com. But without further ado, let's begin and see if we can unravel the mystery that is modern malocclusion. Exciting, right? So from a broad perspective, only about 1/3 of the US population has normal occlusion, while 2/3 have some degree of malocclusion, which refers to crookedness of the teeth and the jaws. In this group, the 60% group, only 5% have problems attributable to a known cause, 65% rather. The remainder are the result of a complex and poorly understood combination of inherited and environmental influences. This quote is drawn from Contemporary Orthodontics, an authoritative text in dental education. While this was published in 2006, it seems even 15 years later, the causes are still largely unknown, and there doesn't seem to be much scientific inquiry in the topic either. Ultimately, the majority of the population is experiencing a medical problem that can be uncomfortable, painful, and expensive to treat, occasionally requiring surgery, as well as physically and mentally harmful for many people. In my mind, this deserves our immediate and global attention, and I'm disappointed at the neglect that this topic has suffered, much to our detriment, I think. However, one of the possible reasons for this lack of interest is due to the popular, rarely spoken assumption that this problem is largely genetic. The popular hypothesis is that in order to evolve bigger brains, humans needed to develop smaller jaws, as there was only so much room for the brain to grow. As the teeth evolved separately from this process, they became too large to fit the shrinking jaws. This led to a tooth size to jaw size discrepancy or imbalance. And this is known to be the major cause of malocclusion, this imbalance in size. Alternatively, another idea is that some element of our modern lifestyle may be a key factor in this skeletal imbalance, and we're going to go through these ideas and more. So back here, I just wanted to mention, here are some out of the 5%, the known causes. These are the major three. So we know that severe gum disease can affect tooth position, certain genetic conditions, syndromes, as well as lower jaw deformity or any kind of trauma which can affect the growth of the jaw. And you can imagine all of these, these don't really represent the average, teenager who requires braces. These are quite rare. So really, it's the whole other 60%, most of the population, who's experiencing a condition that we don't really seem to know much about. But before we go ahead, let's take a minute to talk about what some of the main forms of malocclusion are. So when a person has jaws that are in the harmonious correct position with the upper front teeth, known as the incisors, just ahead of the bottom ones, this is normal occlusion or class 1 occlusion. If the teeth are crowded in this position, it is referred to as class 1 malocclusion. So we can see here, this is the upper jaw, the lower jaw, also represented here and here. So the upper jaw is the maxilla, the lower jaw is the mandible. If the upper incisors are too far ahead of the bottom ones, which is quite common, this indicates that the bottom jaw is too far backwards, and we call this excessive overjet or class 2 malocclusion. Another variant of this type of malocclusion is overbite, when the teeth are vertically overlapping the lower teeth. The uppers are overlapping the bottom ones, and this can make the bottom teeth difficult to see. Often overjet and overbite are confused. Finally, if the lower front teeth are ahead of the top ones, this indicates that the upper jaw is too far back, as we can see here, and we call this an underbite. So according to the Australian Society of Orthodontists, when extra teeth or abnormally large teeth create a malocclusion, the culprit is usually genetic in nature. Other inherited traits involve jaws that are too small to accommodate a full set of teeth, and misaligned jaws that did not form properly. In most cases, underbites, overbites, or crooked teeth are genetic and cannot be avoided. At the risk of coming across as arrogant, I think there are a number of reasons why this proposal of a largely genetic cause, which seems to be considered an obvious fact by the scientific consensus, is actually not so convincing. One of the reasons for this is due to what we know about evolutionary adaptations or natural selection. So let's explain. We know that malocclusion is associated with a variety of issues, such as excessive wear of teeth, gum disease and injury, and tooth decay. Another common problem related to crowding is impacted wisdom teeth, which occurs when the jaws are horizontally too small to fit the third molars. And the third molars are what we can see here. This can lead to pain, swelling, cavities, cysts, as well as inflammation and destruction of the adjacent teeth and bone. So this tooth here, and this one as well, can actually grow on this horizontal angle as we see here and actually destroy the molar in front of it, which is quite horrific actually, I think. So we know that there's only a small minority of wisdom teeth which are free from issues, and because of this, most wisdom teeth in the more developed world will need removal. Now, because crowding and impaction are so highly associated with a variety of health problems, this begs some interesting questions. If this is largely due to a genetic issue that has existed for millennia, why does it occur in such high frequencies today, seemingly unaffected by natural selection? How is it that we did not evolve ways to avoid having these issues in the first place? Furthermore, what exactly were our ancestors doing before the inventions of anesthetic and surgical tools required to remove these maddening molars? It's hard for me to believe that so many of our ancestors were constantly just dying in agony due to wisdom teeth infections in what were already incredibly harsh environments. And even if they did, how could they pass down the genes responsible for these problems at such high frequencies, to the point where most of the modern population today is affected? If anything, it calls into question the supposed wisdom of our evolutionary path. At least anecdotally, I haven't been able to find ancient records which discuss this as being a significant problem, which I imagine we would if it truly was as big an issue as it is today. Something else to keep in mind is how important correctly functioning jaws were to our survival prior to the modern day feed of mashed potatoes, bread, pasta, liquid calories, and the other highly processed foods we all know and love. One would barely need a pair of functioning teeth to consume these things with ease. But historically, our dietary story was quite different. For most of our evolution, we subsisted on very tough, partially cooked plant and animal foods, which were very low in calories, requiring hours of intense chewing daily. An example can be seen here of an Australian Aboriginal man eating a piece of lean meat. From the striations present in his shoulders, we see that significant amounts of not only jaw but upper body strength is needed to enjoy this meal. To survive on such a diet, knife, fork, and blender not included, properly functioning jaws and teeth would be essential. So it isn't hard to imagine how severe crowding or an underbite could be a death sentence in a situation like this prior to industrialization. Finally, because crowding is seen as less attractive, we would expect sex selection to play a role here as well, as those with malocclusion may be less likely to pass on their genes. And yet, despite all of these factors, which presumably would limit the frequency of malocclusion in the interests of survival and reproduction, we are currently in a situation where most of us are affected. For these reasons and more, I'm just not convinced that genetics is the major factor it's presumed to be. In fact, if we do want to determine whether or not human genetics is the problem, maybe we can find answers by observing animals we are genetically similar to. On planet Earth, there are over 5,000 mammals, and yet among them, we seem to be the only ones with highly maloccluded mouths. Ask yourself, when was the last time you saw a horse with crowding, a tiger with an underbite, or a chimpanzee that required wisdom teeth removal due to small jaws? According to anthropologist Peter Lucas, virtually any mammalian jaw in the wild will be a perfect occlusion, a very nice Hollywood-style dentition. If so, this would make us the odd ones out. In the 60s, the historian Collier compared the rate of malocclusion in various animal orders based on thousands of specimens, and the percentages are shown here in the last column. As we can see, most of these have very low rates of malocclusion, but we see with primates at 27%, while still lower than ours, which is 65%, still a bit of an anomaly in the animal kingdom, so let's take a closer look. When this data is broken down further, we see that OW, or Old World monkeys, have a higher rate of malocclusion than most other primates, as seen in column 4. However, the research notes that many of these irregularities are so slight as to be insignificant. Column 5, sorry, this is column 5, column 4, shows the percentage of irregularity in these two groups when such cases were excluded. Another researcher, Mills, states that these dental issues are usually mild and affect the occlusion but little. They fall into class 1, and similar conditions are seen in man, where the condition is often more severe. Among the primates, no instances of class 2 occlusion were found, which is really interesting, as this can affect up to half of modern people. The 6th column shows the rate of underbites, and as we can see in Colibinae, this seems to be rather high. However, evidence indicates that this is likely an adaptive mechanism, and we can see that if anything, the underbite in Colibinae is adaptive, whereas in human beings it seems to be maladaptive. But what happens when these animals are brought into captivity? Collier's data also found that captive primates had far higher levels of malocclusion than those living as in the wild. And this indicates, well, it could indicate that something environmental is at play here. So we have established that malocclusion in modern humans appears far greater than any mammal studied, including our own closest interspecies relatives, the primates, making us something of an anomaly. Where do we go from here? Well, if we want to determine whether or not this is truly genetic or the result of some modern environmental factor or group of factors, what better place to look than our own pre-modern past? We have been anatomically human for at least 300,000 years. We would therefore expect human dental remains dated within this time frame to have similar facial and dental structure to modern humans, and therefore similar rates of malocclusion too. But to make this even more accurate, I want to focus largely on skulls dated within the last 20,000 years, as this seems far too small a time frame for significant physical alterations to occur. Presented here is Kostenki 14, one of the first Paleolithic skulls I came across for my high school project. He was found in the Kostyonki-Borshovo archaeological complex in Russia. As we can see, he has a robust, wide facial structure and dental arches. housing 32 straight teeth, including fully erupted and functional third molars, which are these ones here, the ones that in modern humans are usually stuck in the gum and need to be surgically cut out. Fascinatingly, this individual also has what is known as a retromolar space. So we can see that, which is the space behind his wisdom teeth. Now, that's pretty interesting, right? Most people, it seems, don't have fully upright wisdom teeth, and even those who do tend to have ones that are sort of like half stuck in the gum. Whereas this person and other Paleolithic skulls, as we will see, have jaws that are so large that they actually have space behind the teeth, which is really fascinating. While in the modern world, so such features would be a rarity, they seem to be rather common here, in the norm, in fact. Here we have Barma Grande 2 and 5, males from Italy, and so we can see that from the dental arches, they have fully erupted third molars too, so it's very similar to Kostenki. And this is something that you will see, no matter where the skull is found, all over the world, really, whether it's through, the movement, or rather the movement of the growth is the same, really. They all have these very forward growing skulls. They always have these very wide dental arches. So here we have Pagliassi, I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce that, 25 and 12, a young female and adolescent male from Italy, dated back to around 24,000 years ago. Very similar story with the wisdom teeth, the wide dental arches, the lack of malocclusion. Minatagawa man from Okinawa, Japan. It's around 20,000 years ago, found, and one of the earliest humans found in East Asia. Villa Bruna 1 from the Villa Bruna rock shelter in Italy. There's lots of Italian skulls that we've been able to find. So we have Predmosti 3 from the Czech Republic, Cheddar Man from Cheddar Gorge, around 26,000 years ago, 9,100 years ago, same story in terms of facial development. We have Spirit Man from Spirit Cave, North America, and Loshbull Man from Loshbull, Luxembourg. Very similar story. F295 from, Kennewick Man from Kennewick, America, and F295 from Motala, Sweden, who may have been a shaman, which explains the interesting getup. White Hawk Woman from White Hawk Hill, Calpea Woman from Gibraltar, F296, Motala, Sweden, Magdalenian Woman, and from Dordogne, France. Interestingly, this individual has impacted mandibular wisdom teeth, one of the first ever recorded instances from this Paleolithic time period. And so this is very interesting, as this is also one of the more recent skulls found in terms of 13 to 15,000 years ago. So this is really right before agriculture started, which is around 12,000 years ago. And I find that very interesting and a little bit of a clue for you as well. So could it be possible that even at this point in history, something happened or was happening to the jaws of humans, which rapidly increased in severity as we became more industrialized? But you might notice, I just wanted to take a moment to, if looking at the reconstructions, we see that the kind of facial structure they have almost kind of reminds me of celebrities in a way. How robust they are, the cheekbones, the jawline, everything is very interesting. And it may be compelling to think that I've just specifically tried to get examples that suit my agenda, but really I've tried to find as many Paleolithic skulls as I could, and they really all seem to tell a very interesting and very similar story. So here we have Avgi, a young woman dated back to 9,000 years ago, and Myrtis, an adolescent girl from less than 2,500 years ago. These reconstructions were done by Oskar Nielsen, who states that when Avgi lived in Greece at the end of the Mesolithic period around 7,000 BC, the region was transitioning from a society of hunter-gatherers to one that began cultivating its own food. She lived during what's considered the dawn of civilization. Avgi has a very unique face, not especially female, skull and features. Myrtis, still a child, does not differ at all in the features we find around us today. Having reconstructed a lot of Stone Age women and men, I think some facial features seem to have disappeared or smoothed out with time. In general, we look less masculine, both men and women today. I find these comments fascinating as they establish two key things. Firstly, that the time difference between Avi and Myrtis was associated with a significant change in lifestyle, a transition from nomadic hunting and gathering to more stable agricultural living. Our eating patterns also changed as we went from a varied diet of many plant and animal foods to growing and subsisting on mostly a handful of grains, so our variety shrunk down quite significantly. Secondly, this change in lifestyle was also apparently associated with a transformation in facial features. If this observation is correct, it seems peculiar that they occurred at the exact same time. I think the obvious question is, could the two be connected? Could lifestyle change have affected facial growth? It's important to note that because Avgi frequently used her lower teeth as a tool, she does have a small underbite. Despite this, as we can see here, she has straight teeth, while Myrtis has a moderate amount of crowding. Comparing their profiles or the side view of their faces, we can understand why. While Avgi has jaws which are more forward or horizontally further developed, but of course, like we said, with the underbite, it can affect how that looks. Myrtis's jaws are less projecting and horizontally smaller, so they don't project out forward as much as Avgi's does, and as much as the Paleolithic skulls we've seen do. To try and demonstrate the importance of forward-grown jaws on proper teeth development, we can look at this admittedly rather poor illustration I've done, which is meant to, so the line is meant to represent the length of the maxilla, and the blocks are meant to represent the teeth. So this shows the 8 teeth that would show on one side of the jaw. So in this first example, because this individual has the maxilla is quite long and forward grown, there's enough room for the teeth, including the last wisdom tooth. In this example, I kept the size of the teeth the same, but all I've done is made the maxilla, made the upper jaw more set back or more recessed, more retruded, all words really meaning the same thing. As a result, there's not enough room for the teeth, including the wisdom teeth, which is still partially erupted, partially stuck in the gum and will probably need removal. So modern research seems to support this idea, showing a clear relationship between facial growth, direction, and the likelihood of impaction. Ultimately, these results seem to put the nail in the coffin, so to speak, of the largely genetic explanation. It seems impossible that humans could have genetically changed so quickly in regards to our facial structure in such a short period of time. I already said that. Especially given that it seemed to occur as soon as we developed agricultural societies. As we stated, one of the ideas is that malocclusion is largely due to the skull increasing in size, which made smaller jaws a necessity. However, in the last 20,000 years, the human brain has actually shrunk in size. If we look to our long extinct cousins, the Neanderthals, not only did they have larger brains and skulls than we did, but they also had properly aligned jaws and teeth. This isn't even mentioning the many other animals which have bigger brains than us, such as the sperm whale, with a cerebral size of nearly 10 kilos, all of which seem to avoid issues with their occlusion. In fact, we've been able to manipulate the skulls of other mammals for centuries, seemingly without running into many dental dilemmas. We've been able to transform large, terrifying wolves into tiny teacup Pomeranian puppies with toy-sized jaws in comparison. And yet, their teeth seem to have kept up with this change quite well. The only group who hasn't seems to be us. So when did this change in facial development begin? If the skull of Myrtis is an indication, it might have something to do with the rise of agriculture, which occurred around 12,000 years ago, give or take. So let's explore this idea. Anthropologist Ron Pinhasi, who studied almost 300 skulls from Anatolia to Europe from 28,000 to 6,000 years ago, states that our findings show that the hunter-gatherer populations have an almost perfect harmony between their lower jaws and teeth. But this harmony begins to fade when you examine the lower jaws and teeth of the earliest farmers. Here we have an example of a hunter-gatherer and early agricultural farmer. As we can see, the mandible or lower jaw on the left has a robust and square-shaped jaw angle with a wide U-shaped dental arch and retromolar space, just like we saw before. The mandible of the farmer, however, has a narrower V-shaped dental arch with less of a robust mandibular angle. That's a bit hard to see from here. Similar findings have also been found elsewhere. Research conducted in Norway looked at rates of malocclusion in 16th century skulls, finding that 36% of them showed objective need for orthodontic assessment, compared with 65% in the modern day sample. And the researchers write that this does indicate an increase in the severity and prevalence of malocclusion in the last 400 to 700 years. So a malocclusion rate of 36% is higher than what we observed during the Paleolithic, which by which I mean malocclusion didn't really seem to exist back then. But even so, it is much lower than the rate we currently see in the more developed countries. These findings have been confirmed in Spain, with 60% of medieval skulls having a normal occlusion, while with the researchers stating that this strengthens the hypothesis that in ancient times, malocclusion was not as generalized as in modern times. Research has also been repeated elsewhere. This idea is supported by anthropologist Jeanette Monge, the keeper of the physical anthropology section at the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. Monge states that it's like the upper jaw, the maxilla, and lower jaw, the mandible, are actually kind of perfectly in unity with each other, and the interesting thing is that was everybody in human history. She pinpoints the emergence of crooked smiles perhaps 150 to 200 years ago, exactly when industrialization really kicked into gear. It happened fast, something significant happened, and it's almost global. What is this? What is this thing? Well, we are going to try and find out. So as we said before, the transition from Paleolithic to agrarian diets seem to have been associated with a change in skeletal development, leading to jaws that are less forward-grown and dental crowding. Because more recent research in medieval and modernized times show increased occlusion issues, could it mean that these changes in jaw structure have intensified in recent millennia and centuries? Research comparing Paleolithic skulls to medieval ones in a Serbian population found that Paleolithic skulls had a markedly decreased basal plane angle and also decreased posterior facial height in comparison to the later groups. Historical growth pattern decreased from prehistoric to medieval times. So let's try to explain this in English. So the basal plane angle is indicated by this blue line. And so an increase in this angle means that the face is essentially growing in a more downward fashion. The increase in facial height means that the face is becoming longer and that the jaws are becoming vertically longer, and the decrease in horizontal growth means that the jaws are less prominent, so that instead of projecting this way, they're flatter and more retruded. These findings seem to perfectly support archaeologist Oscar Nielsen's observations regarding the smoothing out of the face, which occurred as humans transitioned to a more agricultural lifestyle. So similar research has also been found in London, which assessed changes from medieval and post-medieval period skulls. And they write that between these two periods, marked changes were observed in nearly all mandibular dimensions, with the most pronounced changes being an overall reduction in mandibular width, so a narrower mandible, a reduction in mandibular ramus height, and an increase in the angulation of the gonial angle. The increase in the gonial angle produces more posterior rotation of the mandible, causing the lower jaw to increase in height, creating the long face facial form. The results here are in line with previous studies examining this. So let's try and break down these findings too. So the part of the lower jaw or mandible is highlighted in blue, is known as the ramus. The corner where the ramus meets the mandibular body is known as the gonian, which we can see here, and this angle creates the gonian angle or the jawline angle. It seems that if the face develops in a forward fashion, the ramus is longer and the gonial angle, this thing, is shorter or more acute. So by that I mean closer to 90 degrees. And so overall what this seems to do is create a shorter, more compact face, and as well as a projecting face and a wider face too. Whereas as we became more modernized, these seem to change, and essentially the ramus shortened in size, and the jaw started to develop downwards with less forward projection. So when they say posterior rotation, it's like this jaw rotated in this direction, rotated in a I guess clockwise direction, a downwards direction. And even though this isn't the most scientific example, I think this also really does, with a human face, it does sort of demonstrate what I mean. In the first example, the ramus is long, here the ramus is short. The jaw is rotated forward, here the jaw is rotated backward, which shortens the ramus. And It also, I think, affects the cheekbones as well. So if the upper jaw is grown really forward, it creates a very prominent, wide facial structure, whereas if the jaws are retruded, it creates a thinner, longer, more recessed facial structure. And so we can see the same thing with human examples. So here we have a modern male who is and here is his X-ray. So we can see that if we look at the way his jaw has developed compared to a Paleolithic skull, it seems to have developed in a more downward fashion. We don't seem to have any real examples of Paleolithic skulls growing in this downward direction. It seems to be a largely modern phenomenon. If we compare this man's facial structure with this individual from the Paleolithic, we also see quite a significant difference in facial form, downward growth versus forward growth. This young woman here, we can see her jaw has grown in a downward direction, and we can see the effect that this has had on the face. Whereas this person, Margot Robbie, even though I unfortunately don't have her X-ray, we can imagine, just based on her jawline angle, that her jaw is probably more reminiscent or more similar to the Paleolithic skulls that we saw previously. Okay, and I also wanted to mention that the woman below here actually needed to have 8 teeth removed because her jaws were so retruded, so set back, and it also led to, I believe, a number of other functional problems. So what is concerning is that this appears to be worsening in even the last 100 years. A study in Austrian adults, which compared a modern sample to 19th century skulls, found significantly higher malocclusion scores, with the researchers concluding that negative changes have occurred in just 1 century. In this study, Robert Corricini was studying multiple groups, and he found that, and he was basically comparing more rural and immigrant parents with their more modernized children. And he states that the transition from predominantly good to predominantly bad occlusion repeatedly occurs within 1 or 2 generations' time in these and other populations. And this weakens the arguments that explain high malocclusion prevalence genetically. So we've explained that malocclusion and changes in jaw structure have been occurring. It seems to have begun in the transition from prehistoric hunter-gatherer settings to the more agrarian settings, and increasing during the transition to medieval times, before getting really bad in our century. The clear question is, what exactly is the cause of this? Well, the most obvious change that comes to mind is diet. So as we said, in the transition from hunter-gatherer to agrarian lifestyles, our diets changed considerably and have continued to change to today. So could the two be connected? So Weston A. Price was a dentist from the early 1900s, and he noticed that in his younger patients, the prevalence and severity of malocclusion seemed more significant than in their parents, which struck him as quite alarming. And so he essentially, I guess, as you do in those days, decided to travel the world. And he interacted with many more modernized and less modernized groups of people. And he essentially took a bunch of photographs and documented them in his book, Nutrition and Physical Degeneration. Now, of course, while this isn't hard evidence, I do think at the very least it could provide a clue. So here are some of the examples he found. So on the left, we have the Australian Aboriginal people. And so we can see that their skulls and their facial form seems to be really reminiscent of the Paleolithic skulls that we saw before. These very attractive wide dental arches, prominent facial growth, and things are really working functionally as they should. However, as they were forced to change into a more modernized diet, we see that not only has this led to severe tooth decay and malocclusion, but also I believe it has affected the facial growth as well. So here's an example of someone living on a more hunter-gatherer kind of lifestyle. So here we have the Seminole Native American people pre and post industrialization, the Melanesian people from the Fiji Islands, and the Swiss from the valleys of Switzerland, with children from the more privileged upper class districts. So Price summarized his findings in his book, and he stated that the less modernized groups had well-formed faces and dental arches reproducing the tribal pattern, while the new generation, after adoption of modern foods, showed marked changes in facial form. He suggested some nutrient or combination of nutrients might be necessary for healthy facial development, and he referred to this as activator X. Unfortunately, there are no known mechanisms linking nutrition with facial form, and I haven't been able to find any research to support this idea. I also think that if there were a clear relationship between nutrient deficiency and malocclusion, we probably would have discovered it by now. After all, we seem to have a good understanding of other deficiency symptoms, and of course, severe malnutrition isn't a huge issue in the more developed countries, despite the high prevalence of malocclusion. If anything, we might expect rural peoples to have lower rates of malocclusion as they become more industrialized due to a reliable food supply. However, this is the opposite of what we see. Therefore, if it isn't the nutritional content of the diet, what else could it be? Other than vitamins and minerals, what also changed is the toughness of the diet. As we've discussed, these people lived on very tough diets, and within fairly short lifespans, their teeth would have been worn down considerably from the force and abrasion. This is starkly contrasted to modern diets, which are very soft and generally don't lead to much wear. Also, if the usage of the chewing muscles known as the masseters, which wrap around the lower jaw, does in fact affect facial development, I don't think this would be a huge surprise. Let me elaborate. All of us are aware of the importance of daily exercise and using our muscles regularly. We know that exercise does not exclusively impact the muscles, but also the underlying bone, increasing its density, thickness, and reducing the risk of fractures. Now, of course, this is a little different to what we've been discussing regarding facial growth direction. However, if muscle usage affects bone development in other parts of the body, would it be so ridiculous to suggest it may impact the bones of the face as well? Why should it be the case that exercising all muscles is important, with the exception of the masseters? If weak muscles elsewhere can lead to poor bone health outcomes, maybe a similar relationship is true for the muscles and bones of the face as well. Unfortunately, this appears to be supported by the available evidence. I should mention that I have not been entirely truthful with you. Although I wanted to pose this as a piece-by-piece, slowly unraveling puzzle, many of the studies and anthropologists we've discussed have already concluded that mastication plays a key role in healthy facial development. Researcher Cramen Tolbadel, who assessed human mandibular variation and changes in diet, found that hunter-gatherers have consistently longer and narrower mandibles than agriculturalists. Rather than a genetic pattern, these results support notions that a decrease in masticatory stress among agriculturalists causes the mandible to grow and develop differently. This development argument also explains why there's often a mismatch between the size of the lower jaw and the dentition, which in turn leads to increased prevalence of dental crowding and malocclusions in modern post-industrial populations. Bit of a mouthful, huh? So this has also been found in other animals. So with squirrel monkeys, for instance, they were raised on either artificially soft or naturally tough diets, and they found that essentially the animals who were raised on soft diets had more crowding and narrower dental arches. Similar research has also shown this in hyraxes, showing who were raised on similar diets. And the researchers stated that these results support the hypothesis that food processing techniques have led to decreased facial growth in the mandibular and maxillary arches in recent human populations. So here we have a Swedish study, which found that individuals with advanced dental wear, so essentially they're using their masseter muscles more, had a smaller gonial angle, shorter face height, and horizontally more further forward projecting faces. And they write that an increase in the function of the masticatory muscle is associated with anterior growth rotation of the mandible and with well-developed angular coronoid and condylar process. A high prevalence of malocclusions were found among patients with myotonic dystrophy. So here what we find is in this study, which is a separate one, what they did is they compared people with myotonic dystrophy, which is a muscular condition in which they can't really use their masseters, with healthy people. And they found that essentially those with myotonic dystrophy had it's almost like a more severe version of what we see above here. So people with let's say normal chewing muscles, normal masseter muscles have this kind of growth direction. Those with stronger muscles have this kind of growth direction. Those with very weak muscles have this very long, very recessed growth direction. And so this is, I think, really interesting because it shows that, it shows, I think, quite, without much questioning, that the masseters are indeed very important in the growth of the face. So myotonic dystrophy is rare, but if very weak masseter muscles lead to a severely downward grown face, could it be that even the muscles of normal people in the modern world are still too weak for optimal facial growth due to our soft diets? Next question we might ask is, if a lack of chewing can lead to downward growth, can consistent chewing lead to forward growth? So in this study, so I should mention, so here's an example of a patient with myotonic dystrophy. As we can see, she really does she has the more downward growth pattern of the face compared to our Paleolithic ancestors. In this study, they essentially got children to chew gum, for a hard resinous Chios gum, I believe, for 2 hours a day for a year, and found that they were more likely to have forward rotation of the mandible, which we can see here. And they stated that this was considerably greater than what would be expected during normal growth. Another study showed that human mandibular shape is associated with masticatory muscle force, with researchers finding that larger masseters were associated with a more rectangular jaw and taller ramus. So here we see those with smaller muscles, smaller masseter muscles. It's more of a slender, narrower, longer, in a more downward growth direction, with a shorter ramus. Here, the ramus is much longer and it's more of a 90-degree angle. And the same is shown for females as well. So really, this data would perfectly explain the facial and occlusal changes we have seen in the transition from the Paleolithic to agricultural times, as well as the medieval and modern age. Every single step of the way, our diets have become softer and more refined, our faces longer and more recessed, and our teeth more crooked. But is this the only explanation? In my research, I also came across fascinating studies to do with breathing and facial development. In the 80s, researchers, very unfortunately, forced primates to breathe through their mouths permanently with nasal obstruction using nose plugs. The end result was similar to what we have seen regarding the effects of soft diets. The animals experienced a wide range of dental and facial abnormalities, such as narrowing of the dental arches, crowding, overbites, underbites, and overjets. Similar findings have been found in humans, with mouth breathing associated with increased facial height, a wider mandibular plane, and gonial angle, and longer faces. Another study found that mouth breathers demonstrated considerable backwards and downward rotation of the mandible, increased overjet, increase in the mandibular plane angle, and narrowing of both upper and lower arches compared to nasal breathers. So it seems that not only masseter usage, but breathing mode could be two key factors affecting facial growth. Both might be needed for stimulation of correct facial development. But why are humans breathing through our mouths? Researchers found that the three most common causes of mouth breathing are allergic rhinitis, enlarged adenoids, and enlarged tonsils. And this might be a bit redundant because enlarged adenoids and tonsils can be a side effect of allergies. Allergic rhinitis seems to be strongly linked with living in a more modernized urban environment, which seems to increase the risk significantly, possibly due to pollution and other contaminants, or even a lack of exposure to healthy microbes. Researchers stated that the prevalence of allergic diseases has increased rapidly in the last century and has become a major public health problem, particularly in modern industrialized populations. Modern diets are not only soft, but they are typically also inflammatory. Healthy diets, such as those made up of fruits, vegetables, nuts, and fish, are associated with a lower prevalence of allergic rhinitis and asthma. Usage of a pacifier may also be implicated, as it encourages the tongue to rest on the floor of the mouth instead of the roof, and is associated with malocclusion. In contrast, breastfeeding is associated with a reduced rate of malocclusion and wider dental arches. Infants who are breastfed who are bottle fed rather, are more likely to develop a steeper or bigger, more downward grown mandibular plane, overjet and retruded mandibles compared to breastfed infants. I personally think that the breastfeeding may encourage infants to keep their tongue on the roof of the mouth, allowing for correct facial development, while baby bottles allow the tongue to lie lazily on the floor of the mouth. Tongue ties are another issue which might be responsible for an inability to place the tongue on the roof of the mouth, as they are associated with facial problems, with malocclusion, as well as things like underbite too. So I've come across some research showing that folic acid, which is the synthetic form of folate found in multivitamins, which have been popularized in the last 100 years or so, may be associated with tongue ties. However, I still do think this nutrient is important to supplement in pregnancy, as it significantly reduces the risk of birth defects, such as serious spinal problems as well. But this idea may be something worth exploring in the future. In this example, I really just wanted to talk a little bit about the different kinds of facial growth that we can see in the modern world. I kind of already went over this before, but I think it's helpful to use a few more examples. It does make me a little uncomfortable scrutinizing people's faces like this, but I felt like really there isn't much other choice other than to try and explain it like this. So here, obviously, we can see that the woman on the left has more of a downward growing face. Her ramus is much shorter. Her jaw is growing in a downwards fashion, and they're also retruded. Whereas in this woman's example, we can see that the ramus is longer, the jaws are more forward rotated, the cheekbones are more prominent, and I think it also affects the shape of the nose as well. So here, because her cheekbones are so forward, her face is so forward, it really provides support to the nose. Whereas in this example, the nose is not as protected, really, or it's not as shielded or supported by the rest of the face, and it can cause it to appear longer. So really, from an aesthetic standpoint, even though I try not to focus on this too much, a downward grown face, in my opinion, is worse in every single respect, and a forward grown face is better in every single respect. Now, this is unfair because obviously this is Superman we're talking about here, but we can see that, he has more of the square shaped jaw, a wider face, it's shorter and it's more forward projecting. Whereas in this example, we see the face is thinner, it's longer, and it's retruded. So it seems the face can either grow in these two directions. We see the same thing here with the facial growth. We can see the mandibular angle especially, there's a really big difference. Here we see the same kind of pattern, forward facial growth and more downward facial growth. Now, a lot of these children with these retruded jaws will have resting open mouth posture like this. And I believe part of this may be due to the fact that because they are mouth breathing so long due to their allergies, it could cause them to have resting open mouth posture. And if you look at any classroom of young kids, you will see this show up quite frequently because the issues are so problematic, they're so popular, or so common, I should say. Now, if the jaws grow too long like this, it can cause excessive gingival show. Whereas in this example, Margot Robbie, the jaw is more compact, which means that there isn't this gingival show. And here we can see the mandibular difference as well. Really same kind of story. Of course, Leonardo DiCaprio, very famous. And part of that fame could be due to his facial growth direction. And so I think that what we often do see is that I think that genetically, people have the blueprint, I could say the blueprint of correct facial growth. And I think most children or most babies are born with this kind of correct facial growth, correct facial structure. However, this can often change for the worse. So we can see here, this child already has a little bit of dental crowding. And if they have crowding when they're 4 or 5 years old, this may indicate that their jaws are already too narrow. But what happens is as they age, the signs become more obvious. The jaw could be becoming thinner and longer. The nose has less support, so it sort of sticks out of the face more. And I think we see a similar case here. Obviously, with photos, the angles and things are all different. But here I would say, most 3 to 5 year olds have this kind of square facial structure. Whereas as they age into their 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, it becomes a lot longer. And I think if you look at most people, if you look at how, their photos of when they were, 5 years old and compare their facial structure to where they are now, some of you might say, hey, wait a second, what went wrong here? What happened to, this person had such a, cute face, and it seemed like it was developing properly, but something went wrong along the way. So the way I think of it, we can see that we are kind of the odd skull out. So this is the skull of a cat, a horse, a dog, and an infant. We can see that all of them really have a 90-degree or close to 90-degree jaw angle. But in adult humans, this can diverge. And so if we look at Paleolithic humans, they also have this close to 90-degree angle. It only seems to be a problem in modern humans that our jaws have started to grow in this more downward fashion. And so I think that that is another clue here. So now I think let's try and summarize what we've learned so far. So the idea that I think is accurate is that for most of human evolution, we lived as hunter-gatherers. We ate a very tough diet. We had little exposure to allergens. We had a very anti-inflammatory diet as well because of all the fruits and veggies and healthy foods and lots of exercise, all fresh air, all very anti-inflammatory, maybe less stress too, I don't know. And I think, and we were obviously breastfed, we didn't have bottles, we didn't have pacifiers, we didn't have synthetic folic acid, I don't know. And so this led to essentially all of these things, the tough diet and the tongue on the roof of the mouth led to forward growing faces. However, as we got into the agrarian stage, we probably didn't start breathing through our mouth a lot more, I can imagine, but our diets considerably softened. And so that's sort of like, if we need two things to have perfect facial growth, maybe that's a little bit, I'm sure it's more nuanced than that. Let's say these two factors are very important. We don't have one, but we still maybe have the other. So we start seeing malocclusion get more common. Maybe as we get into the medieval stage, things get a little worse, diets become softer, and maybe less healthy, less nutritious, more processed, drinking more, doing more, maybe things like cigarettes or, well, I'm sorry, not cigarettes, but the other kinds of illicit substances, maybe during the medieval time. And of course, here we are now, which is, a very polluted environment for a lot of us. Very soft diets, which are also very inflammatory. We've got bottles, we've got pacifiers, we've got really everything's going wrong. It's kind of a disaster. And yes, so I think this is essentially why things are getting a lot worse. But did you really need me to tell you that? Okay, so what are possible recommendations? Obviously, people are very restricted in what they can do, and I don't really feel comfortable recommending anything in particular, but I think maybe these are things that we could look into. So first of all, look at maternal diet, maybe paternal diet too. So the diets of the mother and the father. So before I suppose getting it on, before having a baby. So it may be beneficial for parents to eat an anti-inflammatory diet because the maternal diet is linked with allergic rhinitis symptoms in children, in their babies. Assess newborn babies for tongue ties and lip ties, which can be clipped. Try to reduce exposure to pollutants if possible. Promote breastfeeding over bottle feeding. Of course, this is not always possible, but I think it's something to look into. Refrain from pacifiers. Baby-led weaning might be possible, might be something to look into. Some argue that the babies need to really wean on their own, as opposed to just being fed at 6 months on the dot, but I'm not too sure about this. So we should assess whether or not the child is breathing through the nose or the mouth. Do they snore at night? Are they breathing nasally at night? Microbial diversity. Should we be playing in the mud as with children when our immune systems are developing? I don't know, but it might be worth looking into. We could encourage chewing gum from a young age, maybe 6 or so when it's safe, but obviously when you're a young child, there's the risk of a choking hazard. So just I think it might be worth looking into. So try to correct occlusion issues early. So you can actually take children to an orthodontist at around 6 or 7 years old, and they have all kinds of appliances and things that could be able to help, such as MSC or maxillary skeletal expansion. And that's really all I have to share with you. So if you've made it this far, thank you so much. And I also wanted to recommend a group that I'm in, a Facebook group called Adult Appliance Support and Discussion, Alf Aga Vivos MSC. So we have really confirmed that these appliances are dangerous and ineffective. MSC and others may be effective, but I think that it's an interesting Facebook group to get into. But I just wanted to say thank you so much for listening, and I really hope this has been helpful. Thank you again. Bye.